I'm back. Mr. Clarke's back. Time to take a look at 1604, the Russian Revolution. This will be a little lengthier than normal as the textbook kind of put together a very extensive section here, and obviously a revolution in Russia. It's going to have a big impact on the rest of the world. It's certainly something of significance. So the key objectives that we'll look at the causes of the March Revolution. Kind of started in February, but it's remembered as the March Revolution. Describe the goals of Vladimir Lenin, the Bolsheviks. Bolsheviks is synonymous with communist or communism. We'll see the rise of Lenin during the October Revolution, and we'll summarize the outcome of the Civil War in Russia. Eventually, we'll see how Vladimir Lenin would build the first strong communist state in the world here in the Soviet Union. Okay, the Tsar at this time is Tsar Nicholas II. His wife is the Tsarina, which is the title of the wife of a Tsar. So Alexandra is the wife of Nicholas II, and she once confided in a friend. They are constantly frightening the emperor with threats of revolution. And here, you see it yourself. We need merely to show ourselves, and at once, their hearts are ours. Was the Tsarina expressing fact, opinion, or a combination of both? Well, the threats of revolution were quite real and factually based. However, the Russian Revolution against the Tsars proved that the Tsarina's assertion that the hearts are ours was an incorrect opinion. So her statement then was a mix of facts and opinion. Number two, where did the Russian Empire extend to in 1914? From Eastern Europe all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So a very vast empire. You can kind of see it outlined there in the purple on the map. So Eastern Europe through the Pacific Ocean, basically bordering just north of China. And then the northeastern corner of the Soviet Union is not too far from Alaska in North America. Three, what type of nation was Russia during the early 1900s? Russia was kind of a backwards country, lacking industry. Landowning nobles, priests, and the Tsar dominated society. Question number 4. How did most Russian citizens live in the early 1900s? Most were poor peasants. They endured stark poverty. There was a very small middle class, and the urban working class was now an emerging class. Number 5, what is a dynasty? This is a long period of domination, usually references in a country when a family with the same last name rules a nation for an extended period of time. The Romanov dynasty ruled Russia for over 300 years. From 1613 to 1917. The very first Romanov and the very first Tsar was Michael Romanov. Mikhail is the Russian version of Michael. Michael, obviously a fine first name. Michael is often associated with greatness, glory, leadership, strength. They're all synonymous with Michael. 6, what type of leader was Tsar Nicholas II? Weak, ineffectual, very young. I think he was 26 years of age when he became the Tsar after the untimely death of his dad. So he was not necessarily prepared to be the Tsar. I wasn't really thinking about that at that point in time. So sometimes if you're not prepared, it could lead to some struggles, and that could be in anything within life, and this is certainly true for Tsar Nicholas II. He did maintain power, as most Tsars did, through intimidation, the use of the secret police, taking care of anybody who might have thought to rise up against him. 8, what group did Marxist revolutionaries target for revolution? Well, we see Marxist, this kind of goes back to the Communist Manifesto in 1848, and we'll kind of reference that again in a moment. So a Marxist revolution, and Karl Marx would advocate that the proletariat, which was the growing class of factory and railroad workers, kind of your common folk, the miners, the urban earners or merchants, These people would eventually rise up against the wealthy within society, against the bourgeoisie. 9. What impact did World War I or the Great War have on Russia? Despite optimism at the very start of the war, Russia soon experienced shortages both on the battlefields as well as on the home front. Factories and transportation systems in Russia failed. Eventually, Russia had to send in a whole bunch of teenagers, not much older than many of you, 15, 16 years of age, to fight in the war. What happened to the undersupplied Russian forces during World War I? Lacking food, supplies, weapons, etc. The spirits of the Russians began to wane. Soldiers were dying in large numbers. Back in 1915 alone, Russia suffered 2 million casualties. What did Tsar Nicholas II attempt to do to kind of turn the war around? And here it's kind of just showed the desperation. I don't know if you can imagine, let's say the President of the United States, like Joe Biden, for example, running to the front lines in a war and kind of taking charge of the military and kind of leading the command on the battlefield. In the case of Tsar Nicholas II, he went to the front lines. He was horseback and kind of, trying to lead the military back to victory, trying to give them an emotional, push. However, he failed, and the war continued to be a disaster for Russia. Mistrust and finger pointing and allegations against the Tsar, his wife, the Tsarina Alexandra, were full effect by 1916 into 1917. Alexandra had come to rely on the advice, as we look at number 12, of Gregory Rasputin. He was thought to be a mystical faith healer, somebody that the Tsarina had relied on quite a bit to help out their son, Nicky. Nicky had hemophilia, which means it's kind of a blood clotting disorder where any type of bruise, it could lead to uncontrollable bleeding. And Rasputin had advised the Tsarina multiple times about the son, and she really developed a sense of trust for the Tsarina. Here's an image of the mystical faith healer, Gregory Rasputin. So here's a prophecy from Rasputin. He made a lot of predictions about the future. When the bell tolls 3 times, it will announce that I've been killed. So basically a church bell rings 3 times, and if Rasputin is killed, he's foreshadowing his own murder. If I am killed by the common men, you and your children will rule Russia for centuries to come. However, if I'm killed by one of your stock, members of the bourgeoisie, nobility, or royalty, you and your entire family will be killed by the Russian people. Pray, Tsar of Russia, pray, my death is by the common men. Rasputin was murdered by royals. Several months later, Tsar Nicholas II, the last of the Tsars, and 18 members of his extended family were killed. So they basically tried to wipe out the entire Romanov dynasty. And kind of the interesting story about Rasputin, he was running away from the royalty. He was trying to kill him. He was shot. He was stabbed, and then fell into a river, and his cause of death was drowning, even though it looked like he was probably killed multiple times even before he reached the river. So that kind of adds to the legacy and the mystery of Gregory Rasputin. Okay. Number 14, why was World War I a major cause of the Russian Revolution? Well, the war used up a lot of the Russian resources, leading to shortages of needed supplies. Famine broke out as well. People were starving, blaming the Tsar, obviously, for the failures. The Russian soldiers, too, were ill-equipped, meaning that they did not have the needed supplies to fight well in the war. The Tsar did a poor job directing the war effort. All these problems increased discontent with the Tsar's government, and eventually would contribute to the revolution. What happened in Russia in March 1917? A revolutionary activity reached the height. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated his throne. Abdicate means to give up power. This ended the 300 and 4-year dynasty, the Romanov dynasty in Russia. The new government that took over was a provisional government. Provisional means temporary until you can actually have an elected leadership put into place. Alexander Kerensky, a name you should be familiar with, he was the leader temporarily of the provisional government from the winter into the fall of 1917, a very short period of time. And then Kerensky made a terrible mistake. Most Russians had had enough of World War I, and had Kerensky pulled Russia out of World War I immediately, perhaps he would have stayed in power. However, the provisional government did not want to accept the loss. They didn't want to give up. This led to even more Russian deaths and more struggles on the home front. What were Soviets? These were a council of workers and soldiers. They were kind of the foundation for the revolution. They met together to look at ways to overthrow the provisional government. The Soviets would then support the Bolsheviks. These were a radical group of Russians who advocated Marxism or communism, who took control of the Soviets through Russia. Bolsheviks are also known as the communists. Just emphasizing that. You should emphasize that yourself as well. Who was a revolutionary leader of the Bolsheviks? Of course, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, sometimes just referenced as Lenin. 21, we look at his background, born in 1870, grew up in a middle-class family. When he was 17, his brother was arrested and hanged for plotting to kill the Tsar. The plot by his brother branded the family as a threat to the Tsar and created intense hatred in Lenin for the Tsarist leadership in the country. What person's ideas had the greatest impact on Lenin? Well, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, the Communist Manifesto. You see the imagery down below. The book itself was kind of the blueprint for what Lenin was striving for in Russia. 23, what happened to Lenin in 1895 as a result of spreading Marxist ideas? He's basically exiled to Siberia and then pushed out of Russia entirely and had to live throughout Europe for a period of time. What did Lenin do while in exile? He wrote a revolutionary newspaper, and he's working basically 24 hours a day towards his goal of a Russian revolution. 25, what was Lenin's plan for the revolution? He called for a small elite group to stage a revolution and then set up a dictatorship of the proletariat, or of the working class people. 26, after the March Revolution in 1917, forced the Tsar to abdicate. What deal behind the scenes did Lenin make with Germany? German leadership saw the return of Lenin to Russia as an opportunity to make a deal with him to get Russia out of the war and close out the Eastern Front for good. So they helped Lenin return to Russia, and Lenin promised to sign an armistice, or an agreement to stop fighting with Germany as soon as he took power. So Lenin basically had the backing of Germany. 27, what person helped Lenin with his Marxist revolution once he arrived in Russia? It's kind of a key co-conspirator in regard to the Russian Revolution or the Marxist Revolution, Leon Trotsky. Leon Trotsky. See him pictured down below, his imagery slowly but surely appearing on the screen. 28, what did Lenin, Trotsky, and the Bolsheviks promise the people? Remember, Bolsheviks is communists. The rallying cry for the Russian Revolution: peace, land, and bread. Peace meaning the end of fighting in World War I, because the war's still ongoing. Land meaning people would have land to work, and then bread, of course, food for the starving people. 29, how the actions and inactions of the Russian provisional government caused the October Revolution. Well, as we alluded to previously, the provisional government continued to fight World War I. The Russian people continued to suffer and die from both the war and the starvation on the home front. And the people began to blame the provisional government under Alexander Kerensky for the failures of the country. 30, what happened in November 1917? Lenin drove the provisional government out of power and the communists took control. Lenin quickly had the entire Romanov extended family rounded up and imprisoned, and shortly thereafter he ordered the execution of 18 Romanov family members, getting his ultimate revenge on the Romanov family for killing his brother. That's Tsar Nicholas II there. That's little Nikki, who had hemophilia. The youngest of the girls is Anastasia. You're probably familiar with her. Which city became the new Bolshevik capital? Moscow. 32, what did the Bolsheviks change their name to? As we know, the communist. '33, why was Lenin's promise of peace, land, and bread an effective message in gaining support for the Bolsheviks? Did he fulfill his promise to the Russian people? Well, he promised the people what they wanted: an end to the involvement in World War I, land ownership for the peasants, so no longer would they be tied to the land and almost be like slaves or serfs, and bread to end the food shortages and starvation. In part, he kept his promises. He provided land to the peasants, and he did remove Russia from the war. However, civil war did erupt under his policy of war communism. Starvation continued because the government seized grain for their own uses. '34, how did Lenin live up to his pledge to Germany to end the war? Lenin agreed to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. That treaty you should be familiar with is the treaty that took Russia out of World War I. They give up a huge chunk of its territory to Germany. The cost of peace was very high for Russia. '35, what happened in Russia from 1918 to 1921? A civil war between Russian communist Reds versus the counter-revolutionaries or Whites took place in Russia. You can see here would be a poster that was kind of a propaganda poster during this period of time. A crusading white knight slays the Red Dragon in the Russian Civil War. It's title for a united Russia. Which side do you think made this poster? Kind of think about it yourself. The white knight on the white horse slaying the Red Dragon. This poster portrays Russia under siege by the Red Dragon with a heroic white knight, or the counter-revolutionary whites, who here are obviously being supported in this poster. Despite this poster, the whites are not going to win the Russian Civil War. '37, what were the causes and effects of Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War? Well, the Allies hoped that if the whites won the Civil War, they would bring Russia back into the war on the Allied side. But even with the support of the Allied forces, the counter-revolutionary whites were unable to defeat the Reds. The Allied intervention caused the victorious communists to distrust the West immediately, so they got off on a bad footing initially. '38, how were the Reds able to defeat the whites in the Russian Civil War? The Reds won the support of the Russian people through a combination of attractive promises, appeals to nationalism, terror tactics, and brutal force. They were led by the charismatic, fiercely determined men who had organized and shaped a common purpose. They also used terror against their own people and against the whites. They used a policy called war communism to seize property and food from the Red Army. The Red Army was very well trained. Also, geography benefited the Reds because they controlled the center of Russia while the whites were scattered about, which made it a little bit more difficult for them to truly fight. With the Civil War over, what did Lenin turn his attention to as we look at number 39? Rebuilding a nation that was devastated from both World War I as well as the Russian Civil War. 40, explain the key provisions of the 1922 Russian Constitution. Constitution was a blended constitution of principles of socialism and democracy. It did establish an elected legislature. All citizens over the age of 18 had the right to vote. All political power and means of production and resources would be controlled by the workers. Renamed the country the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or also known as the Soviet Union or USSR. And it was a multinational empire initially made up of 13 Soviet republics. So we look here, all these different areas here: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. These are all part of a broader United Soviet Union, 13 Soviet republics. Today, these are all independent countries, but temporarily they are all under the Soviet Union. Okay, 41, the communists drew up a constitution that, according to the text, asserted that all political power, resources, and means of production would belong to workers and peasants. How truthful was this assertion? How do you think this affected the credibility of the Soviet Union? The communists were not truthful in their constitution. The Communist Party and not the people controlled the government and the economy into the 1990s. This probably reduced the credibility of the Soviet Union, making people less likely to support the Soviet leaders in the future. How were war communism and the new economic policy different in their policies and results? Well, war communism did away with free enterprise and private property. The government seized control of businesses and resources, including food, and made all the major economic decisions for the country. However, the economy faltered under this communist model, so Lenin instituted a new economic policy, which allowed for limited capitalistic ventures. Under this policy, the Soviet economy began to improve. 43, what happened in the Soviet Union in the weeks after Lenin's death? Well, a power struggle emerged between Leon Trotsky on the left, Joseph Stalin on the right, for leadership in the Communist Party, and eventually the leadership in the country. What happened after Stalin ousted Trotsky and took power? Trotsky was forced to flee the nation, but remained very critical of Stalin while living in exile in Mexico. Stalin got irritated, agitated, and upset, and he wasn't the type of person to accept that very nicely. So in 1940, eventually, after getting sick of hearing Trotsky's ramblings and criticism, he had him assassinated in Mexico. Some of Stalin's agents went down to Mexico, found Trotsky, and as there's a struggle ensuing at Trotsky's home, the assassins grabbed an ice pick from an ice bucket and basically hacked him to death in the back and killed him. 45, Lenin, before his death, indicated he had concerns about Stalin, which were revealed in Lenin's own words. Lenin said in the phrase, and here's the phrase from Lenin: sufficient caution should be urged when considering Stalin for leadership positions. So that was the final message of Lenin to the Soviet people. Lenin was afraid that Stalin would use excessive power, which indeed he would, and would not be cautious or careful to avoid the abuse of power. And of course, Stalin was a tyrant. And finally, the lesson reflection: according to Marxism, the proletariat would overthrow the government, set up a classless society in which the wealth and power would be equally shared. Did Lenin's version of Marxism remain true to the spirit of Marxism? Why or why not? No. Lenin and the Bolsheviks were not true to Marxism. Instead of a classless society, Lenin established a dictatorship of the proletariat. Instead of sharing power and wealth equally, the Bolsheviks or communists held power and decided how wealth should be distributed. In general, the government completely controlled the economy. Take a moment or two to get down anything you need. And remember, you can always pause along the way if need be. Hopefully you enjoyed our discussion here on the formation of the Soviet Union, the ousting of the Tsarist system in Russia. And until next time, when we take a little closer look at Stalin's leadership in the Soviet Union, Mr. Clarke is out.